Have you ever wondered what drives someone to knock on the door of the most dangerous man in the city? Sometimes desperation creates the most unlikely alliances, and sometimes a child's courage can change everything. Speaking of courage, I'm curious where you're watching from tonight. Does your city have neighborhoods where people whisper about powerful figures who operate in the shadows? Let me know in the comments, because this story might feel closer to home than you think. The grandfather clock in Mateo Herrera's study had just chimed midnight when the soft knock echoed through his compound. He looked up from the ledgers spread across his mahogany desk, his dark eyes narrowing. At 34, Mateo had built an empire that commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout the city. His estate sat like a fortress in the hills, surrounded by walls topped with razor wire and patrolled by men who would kill without hesitation to protect what lay within. No one approached his door uninvited. No one knocked at midnight unless they carried a death wish. The knock came again, barely audible but persistent. 3 soft taps, like someone afraid to disturb but desperate enough to try anyway. Mateo's hand moved instinctively to the Glock resting on his desk. In his world, midnight visitors brought trouble or betrayal, sometimes both. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts and expecting the worst from everyone who crossed his path. The intercom on his desk crackled to life before he could reach for it. Diego, his head of security, sounded confused through the speaker. "Boss, you need to see this. There's a kid at the front gate. A little girl." Mateo's finger paused over the weapon. A child. In 15 years of running operations that most people only whispered about in dark corners, he had never encountered anything like this. Children belonged in beds at midnight, not standing outside the gates of men like him. "Put her through to the monitors," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had built his reputation. The wall of screens across from his desk flickered to life, revealing the front entrance of his compound. The camera showed a small figure standing just outside the massive iron gates, barely tall enough to reach the call button. She was maybe 8 years old, wearing a pink nightgown and flip-flops, her dark hair tangled around her shoulders. She clutched something against her chest, a stuffed animal or doll, and she was shivering in the cool night air. Mateo stared at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. A trick, a distraction, someone using a child to lower his guard before making their real move. He had seen enough cruelty in his life to know that innocence could be weaponized, that children could be used as pawns in games deadlier than chess. But something about the way she stood there, small and alone and trembling, stirred something in his chest that he had buried years ago. Something that remembered what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. "Scan the perimeter," he ordered into the intercom. "Full sweep. Check for anything unusual. Anyone watching. Any vehicles that don't belong." While his security team conducted their search, Mateo watched the little girl on the monitor. She looked up at the camera as if she could see him watching her, and when she spoke into the intercom, her voice was small but steady. "Mister, I need your help. My tia Elena is gone and nobody will listen to me. I know you're important. I know people are scared of you, but maybe that means you can find her." The words hit Mateo like a physical blow. She knew who he was, what he represented, and she had come anyway. This child had walked through streets that hardened criminals avoided after dark, had somehow reached his compound without being stopped by police or rivals or any of the 100 dangers that lurked in the night. She had done all of this because she believed he might help her. "Boss," Diego's voice crackled through the intercom again. "Perimeter is clean. No signs of surveillance or backup. She's alone." Mateo studied the child on the screen, weighing his options. Every rational part of his mind told him to send her away, to have his men escort her to the nearest police station and wash his hands of whatever tragedy had brought her to his door. He was not a social worker. He was not a hero. He was a man who trafficked in violence and power, who had blood on his hands and enemies who would kill him without a second thought. But she was so small, standing there in the darkness with nothing but a stuffed animal and a desperate hope that the monster everyone feared might somehow save the person she loved. "Open the gate," he said quietly. "Bring her to the front entrance. Search her gently. She's just a child." He was already moving as he gave the orders, crossing his study and heading for the marble foyer of his mansion. This was insane. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of emotional decision that could get him killed in his line of work. But when he opened the heavy wooden doors of his home, When he saw the little girl standing on his doorstep with tears streaming down her face and terror in her dark eyes, Matteo knew he was already committed to whatever came next. She looked up at him, this child who should have been asleep in her bed, safe and protected from the realities of the world he inhabited. Instead, she stood in his doorway at midnight, clutching a worn teddy bear and shaking with exhaustion and fear. "My name is Sophia," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My tia Elena takes care of me. She's all I have left in the whole world, and now she's gone." Matteo crouched down so he was at eye level with her, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. He had interrogated hardened criminals who broke under pressure, but this 80-year-old girl was looking at him with more courage than most grown men could muster. "Tell me what happened, Sophia," he said gently. "Start from the beginning." 3 days ago, she came home late from work. She was really scared about something, talking on the phone in Spanish really fast. She kept looking out the windows and checking the locks. She told me we might have to go away for a while, that she might have to tell the police about some bad things she learned at work. Sophia wiped her nose with the back of her hand, leaving a streak across her cheek. "The next morning, she didn't wake me up for school. I found her bed still made up, like she never came home. Her purse was on the kitchen counter with her phone and keys, but she was just gone." Matteo felt something cold settle in his stomach. Elena. The name was familiar, though he could not place it immediately. A woman who worked somewhere that gave her access to information worth killing for. A woman who had stumbled onto something dangerous enough to make her disappear without a trace. "Did you call the police?" he asked. Sophia nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "They said she was probably just out with a boyfriend or something. They said adults go missing all the time and most of them come back on their own. They said I was too young to understand. But I know something bad happened to her. I know she wouldn't leave me alone like this." Matteo's jaw tightened. He had no respect for law enforcement in this city, most of whom were either corrupt or incompetent, but their dismissal of a child's legitimate concerns made his blood boil. Elena was clearly in danger, and the people who should have protected her had failed in the most fundamental way possible. "What does your aunt do for work?" he asked. "She's a social worker. She helps kids who don't have parents or whose parents hurt them. She's always trying to save people, especially kids. Last week she was really upset about some children who went missing from foster care. She said someone was taking them and selling them, and that the police weren't doing enough to stop it." The pieces clicked into place in Matteo's mind like bullets sliding into a chamber. Human trafficking. Children disappearing from the system that was supposed to protect them. Elena Morales had stumbled onto something that threatened a very lucrative and very dangerous business, and now she was gone. Matteo knew about the trafficking operation because he had been hunting them for months. Not out of any sense of civic duty, but because they had made the mistake of trying to operate in his territory without his permission. They had taken children from neighborhoods under his protection, and that kind of disrespect could not be tolerated. But this was bigger than territorial disputes now. This was about a child who had walked through hell to reach his door because she believed he was her only hope. This was about a woman who risked everything to protect the vulnerable and had paid the price for her courage. "Sophia," he said carefully, "did you see any strangers around your apartment recently? Anyone watching or following your aunt?" She nodded eagerly, relief flooding her face at being taken seriously. "There were 2 men in a black car. They were there for 3 days before Tia Elena disappeared. She saw them too. She made me promise not to go outside alone and to stay away from the windows." Matteo pulled out his phone and made a call that would set dangerous wheels in motion. When Diego answered, Matteo's voice carried the cold efficiency that his enemies had learned to fear. "I need everything we have on Elena Morales. Social worker, probably mid-20s, investigating missing foster children. She was taken 3 days ago. I want surveillance footage, phone records, employment information. And I want it within the hour." He ended the call and looked back at Sophia, who was watching him with wide eyes that held more hope than any child should need to carry. "I'm going to find your aunt," he said, the words carrying the weight of an oath. "But you can't go back to your apartment. If the men who took Elena know about you, it isn't safe. You'll have to stay here until we get her back." Sophia's face crumpled with relief and exhaustion. She had been carrying this burden alone for 3 days, trying to convince adults to listen, to care, to act. Now, finally, Someone was taking charge of the nightmare that had become her life. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching her teddy bear tighter. "I knew you would help." Tia Elena always says that sometimes the people everyone thinks are bad are actually the ones who do the most good. As Mateo led Sofia into his home, settling her in a guest room with soft blankets and promises that she was safe now, he wondered what Elena Morales was like. What kind of woman raised a child with enough courage to seek help from the devil himself? What kind of social worker inspired such devotion that an 80-year-old would walk through the darkness to save her? He was about to find out, because Mateo Herrera had just declared war on the people who had taken Elena Morales. They had made the mistake of hurting someone under his protection, even if he had not known she was under his protection until tonight. And when Mateo Herrera went to war, he did not lose. The warehouse sat in the industrial district like a cancer, surrounded by abandoned lots and rusted shipping containers that provided perfect cover for the kind of business that thrived in shadows. Mateo crouched behind a concrete barrier, watching his men take their positions around the building. Through his night vision scope, he could see 2 guards posted at the main entrance, their automatic weapons visible even in the darkness. Diego's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Thermal imaging shows at least 12 people inside. Most of them are in the back section, probably the holding area. 3 guards on patrol, 1 in an office on the 2nd floor." Mateo's jaw tightened as he processed the information. 12 people meant Elena was not the only victim being held in this hellhole. The traffickers had been busy, and every hour they delayed meant more suffering for the women trapped inside. "Remember," he said into his radio, his voice carrying the deadly calm that his men knew meant someone was about to die. "The women are not to be harmed under any circumstances. Anyone who endangers them answers to me personally." The assault was swift and brutal. Mateo's men moved through the warehouse like shadows, neutralizing guards with the kind of precision that came from years of operating in hostile territory. He took point, leading the charge toward the back section where the thermal imaging had detected the largest cluster of people. The door to the holding area was reinforced steel with multiple locks, designed to keep desperate people from escaping. Mateo planted the charges himself, stepping back as the explosion tore through the metal like paper. The sound echoed through the warehouse, followed by screams and shouts in multiple languages. Inside, he found them. 8 women chained to pipes along the walls, their faces gaunt with hunger and terror. Some were clearly teenagers, others appeared to be in their 20s or 30s. All of them cowered when the armed men burst through the destroyed door, expecting violence from their captors. Elena Morales sat in the far corner, her dark hair matted with blood from a head wound, her clothes torn and dirty. Even in the dim light, Mateo could see that she was different from the others. Where the rest showed the broken resignation of people who had given up hope, Elena's eyes burned with fury and defiance. She was planning something, even chained and injured and surrounded by armed traffickers. When she saw Mateo and his men, her expression shifted from calculation to confusion. These were not the same people who had taken her, but they were clearly dangerous, clearly armed, clearly not law enforcement. She pressed herself further back against the wall, using her body to shield a younger girl who sat beside her. "My name is Mateo Herrera," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage that was building in his chest at the sight of these women suffering. "Sofia sent me to find you." Elena's eyes widened with shock and then terror. She knew his name, knew what it meant. In her world of social work and child protection services, Mateo Herrera was the boogeyman that parents used to scare their children into staying away from certain neighborhoods. He was violence personified, a man who controlled territory through fear and brutality. And he was telling her that Sofia, her 80-year-old niece, had somehow contacted him. "Where is she?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse from screaming and dehydration. "What did you do to her?" "She's safe," Mateo said, pulling out his phone to show Elena a photo that Diego had taken an hour earlier. Sofia was asleep in the guest bedroom, clutching her teddy bear, looking peaceful for the first time in days. "She's at my house, under my protection. She came to me because she knew the police wouldn't help her find you." Elena stared at the photo, tears streaming down her bruised face. Sofia was alive and unharmed. After 3 days of terror and torture, after imagining every horrible thing that could have happened to the child she loved more than her own life, This confirmation of safety hit her like a physical blow. Mateo's men worked quickly to free the women, cutting through chains and offering water and blankets. They moved with military efficiency, but also with surprising gentleness, speaking softly to victims who flinched at sudden movements. This was not the behavior Elena expected from a criminal organization. The young girl beside Elena was maybe 16, clearly American, probably grabbed from a bus station or shopping mall. She clung to Elena's arm as the chains were cut away, too terrified to trust these new arrivals. "They're here to help us," Elena told her, though the words felt strange in her mouth. She was telling a trafficking victim to trust a cartel leader, and somehow it felt like the right thing to do. Mateo himself cut through Elena's restraints, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the head wound that was still bleeding sluggishly. She had been beaten, probably for fighting back or trying to protect the other women. The sight of her injuries made something primitive and violent stir in his chest. "Can you walk?" he asked. Elena nodded, though she swayed when she tried to stand. The days without food and water, combined with the head trauma, had left her weak and disoriented. Mateo caught her arm when she stumbled, steadying her with hands that were calloused from violence, but held her with the care someone might use with fine crystal. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said. "The other women first," Elena replied automatically. "Some of them are in worse condition than I am." Mateo studied her face, seeing the social worker who had risked everything to protect vulnerable children. Even after 3 days of captivity and torture, her first concern was for others who were suffering. No wonder Sophia had such courage. She was learning from a woman who put others before herself even when facing death. "My men will take care of all of you," he said. "But Sophia needs to see that you're alive and safe. She's been worried sick." The ride back to Mateo's compound was a blur of sirens and flashing lights as his personal physician met them at the estate gates. Dr. Vasquez was accustomed to treating gunshot wounds and knife cuts, but he worked with equal skill on Elena's injuries, cleaning and bandaging her cuts while checking for signs of concussion. Elena submitted to his care in a daze, still processing the impossible reality of her rescue. She was in the home of one of the most dangerous men in the city, being tended to by a doctor who clearly worked for criminals, surrounded by armed guards who treated her with inexplicable respect. When Sophia burst into the medical room, Elena's composure finally cracked. The child threw herself into her aunt's arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion and the release of 3 days of terror. Elena held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid reality of her small body safe and unharmed. "I knew he would find you," Sophia whispered against Elena's shoulder. "I knew Mr. Mateo would bring you home." Elena looked over Sophia's head at Mateo, who was standing in the doorway watching their reunion with an expression she could not read. He had saved her life, saved the lives of 8 women who would have disappeared into the trafficking network without his intervention. He had done it because a child had knocked on his door at midnight and asked for help. But he was still a criminal. Still a man who made his living through violence and intimidation. Still someone whose protection came with a price that Elena was not sure she could afford to pay. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words inadequate for what he had done, but the only ones she could manage. Mateo nodded once, then stepped back to give them privacy. Elena watched him go, noting the way his men moved aside respectfully, the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority. She should be terrified of him. She should be planning how to escape from his compound as soon as possible. Instead, she found herself thinking about the gentleness in his hands when he had freed her from the chains, the fury in his voice when he had seen her injuries, the way he looked at Sophia like she was precious cargo that required his personal protection. Dr. Vasquez finished his examination and declared that Elena needed rest, fluids, and time to heal from her ordeal. Mateo had prepared a suite of rooms in the guest wing, spacious and comfortable and nothing like the prison cell she had expected. Sophia refused to leave her side, curling up in the massive bed like a kitten who had finally found safety. As Elena drifted toward sleep for the first time in days, she heard voices in the hallway outside her room. Mateo was giving orders to his security team, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire, but also a protective concern that surprised her. "No one gets near them without my permission," he was saying. "I want guards posted around the clock." They've been through enough. Elena closed her eyes, Sophia's warm weight against her side, grounding her in the reality of safety. She was alive. Sophia was alive. They were both under the protection of a man who should have been their enemy, but had instead become their unexpected savior. Tomorrow she would have to figure out what came next, how to rebuild their lives after the trafficking ring had shattered their world. Tomorrow she would have to confront the complicated reality of owing her life to someone whose methods she should condemn. But tonight, for the first time in 3 days, Elena Morales slept without fear. Elena woke to the sound of Sophia's laughter drifting through the open windows of their suite, a sound she had thought she might never hear again. For a moment, she lay still in the enormous bed, trying to process the surreal reality of her situation. 3 days ago, she had been chained to a pipe in a warehouse, certain she would die there. Now she was sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets in a room larger than her entire apartment, listening to her niece play in the gardens of a cartel leader's estate. The irony was not lost on her. In her 8 years as a social worker, she had dedicated her life to protecting children from the kind of violence that men like Mateo Herrera represented. She had testified in court cases against gang members, had worked to remove children from homes where criminal activity put them at risk. And now she was accepting the protection of someone whose very existence contradicted everything she believed about justice and law. But Sophia was laughing. After 3 days of terror and uncertainty, Sophia was laughing again. Elena made her way to the window, drawn by the sound of her niece's voice. The guest wing overlooked a sprawling garden that would not have been out of place at a luxury resort. Sophia was running across the perfectly manicured lawn, chasing a small dog while Mateo watched from a patio table, a cup of coffee in his hands, and something that might have been a smile softening his usually stern features. He had changed from the tactical gear he had worn during the rescue, trading it for dark jeans and a simple white button-down shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Without the armor and weapons, he looked younger, more approachable, though Elena could still see the alertness in his posture that spoke of constant vigilance. Sophia stumbled and scraped her knee on the stone pathway, her laughter turning to tears in the way that only children could manage. Before Elena could move toward the door, Mateo was already there, kneeling beside Sophia with the kind of gentle concern that seemed impossible from a man whose reputation was built on violence. Elena watched him examine the scrape, his large hands impossibly tender as he cleaned the wound with a tissue and murmured reassurances in Spanish. Sophia clung to his arm, seeking comfort from this man who had somehow become her protector in the space of 2 days. When he pulled a cartoon bandage from his pocket, Sophia's tears transformed back into giggles. The sight hit Elena with unexpected force. This was not the behavior of a monster. This was a man who carried cartoon bandages in his pocket just in case an 80-year-old needed comfort. This was someone who had dropped everything to rescue a kidnapped woman because a child had asked him to, and who was now treating that child with the kind of patient affection usually reserved for beloved family members. Elena's chest tightened with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. She had spent 3 days telling herself that surviving the trafficking ring was what mattered, that accepting help from Mateo was a necessary evil that she would endure until she could return to her normal life. But watching him with Sophia, seeing the transformation that came over his face when he looked at her niece, Elena realized that nothing about this situation was as simple as she had tried to make it. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Elena opened it to find a woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed, and carrying a tray of fresh fruit and coffee. She introduced herself as Rosa, Mateo's housekeeper, and explained that she had been instructed to ensure Elena had everything she needed. "Mr. Herrera thought you might be hungry," Rosa said with the kind of maternal concern that suggested she was accustomed to caring for people who had been through trauma. "He also asked me to let you know that there are clothes in the closet that should fit you. Clean clothes in your size." Elena accepted the tray gratefully, realizing that she had not eaten a real meal in days. As she sipped the coffee, which was better than anything she had ever tasted, Rosa bustled around the room, opening curtains and checking that towels had been replaced in the en-suite bathroom. "He's a good man," Rosa said quietly, apparently reading Elena's thoughts. "People see the reputation and they think they know who he is. But I've worked for him for 10 years, and I've seen what he really is." He protects people who can't protect themselves. He never forgets a kindness, and he never forgives cruelty to the innocent. Elena wanted to ask what Rosa meant, wanted to understand how someone could reconcile working for a criminal with their sense of morality. But before she could form the questions, Sophia burst through the door with Matteo behind her, both of them carrying art supplies. "Tio Elena," Sophia announced breathlessly, "Mr. Matteo has paints, and I'm going to teach him how to make handprint flowers like you showed me." Matteo looked slightly overwhelmed by the prospect of art instruction from an 80-year-old, but his expression was fond rather than annoyed. Elena realized that this man, who commanded absolute obedience from hardened criminals, was about to let a child cover his hands with paint because it would make her happy. "I should warn you," Elena said, finding herself almost smiling for the first time in days, that Sophia's art projects tend to be more enthusiastic than neat. "You might want to change shirts." Matteo glanced down at his expensive white shirt, then shrugged with the careless confidence of someone who could afford to replace anything. Clothes can be cleaned or replaced. Memories with Sophia are irreplaceable. The words hit Elena harder than they should have. This was a man who understood what mattered, who valued a child's happiness over material possessions. She watched as he rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with scars that spoke of a violent past, and let Sophia direct him through the process of creating paint handprints on construction paper. Within minutes, both Sophia and Matteo were covered in purple and yellow paint, laughing as Sophia tried to arrange their handprints into flower shapes. Elena found herself genuinely smiling for the first time since her kidnapping, caught up in the simple joy of watching her niece play with someone who clearly adored her. When Sophia ran to wash her hands, Elena and Matteo were left alone for the first time since the rescue. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions Elena was not sure she wanted answered and awareness she was not ready to acknowledge. "Thank you," she said finally. "For this. For her. For everything you've done." Matteo studied her face with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "You don't have to thank me for treating her well. She's remarkable, brave and kind and loyal. She reminds me of someone I used to know." There was pain in his voice when he said it, old grief that he was not trying to hide. Elena found herself curious about that pain, about the person who had inspired such lasting sorrow. Before she could ask, Matteo continued, "You did well, raising her. Whatever else has happened, you gave her a foundation of love and courage that couldn't be broken even when she was terrified." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the praise. Raising Sophia had been the most important thing she had ever done, and having that recognized by someone who clearly understood children meant more than she expected. "She lost her parents when she was 3, Elena said quietly. "Car accident. I was barely 20 and had no idea how to take care of a child. I made so many mistakes." Matteo's expression softened. "The mistakes don't matter. What matters is that you loved her enough to keep trying, that you built a life where she felt safe enough to be brave when she needed to be." Something shifted in the air between them as they looked at each other, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or obligation. Elena found herself noticing things she should not have been noticing. The way his eyes crinkled slightly when he was thinking, the surprisingly full curve of his lower lip, the way his presence seemed to fill the room without him making any effort to dominate it. This was dangerous territory. Elena knew she should step back, should maintain the professional distance that would allow her to accept his protection without complicating things with attraction. But when Matteo moved closer to help her clean paint from her hands, when his fingers brushed against hers as he handed her a towel, Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. He noticed. She could see it in the way his eyes darkened, in the slight pause in his movements. For a moment, they stood frozen, both of them aware that something was building between them that had nothing to do with rescue or protection and everything to do with the kind of attraction that could change lives. Then Sophia's voice called from the bathroom, asking for help with the soap dispenser, and the moment shattered. Elena stepped back quickly, busying herself with cleaning the art supplies while Matteo went to help Sophia. But the awareness remained, crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. That evening, Elena discovered more about the man who had saved her life. She had been looking for Sophia and found her in Matteo's study, curled up in a leather chair while he worked at his desk. What she heard made her pause in the doorway, listening to a conversation that revealed layers she had not expected. A man with a heavy accent was speaking in rapid Spanish, reporting on something that made Mateo's jaw tighten with anger. Elena's Spanish was limited, but she caught enough to understand that they were discussing the trafficking operation, the network that had held her captive. "No children," Mateo said firmly in English, apparently aware that Elena was listening. "I don't care how much money they offer or what connections they claim to have. Anyone who trades in children is not welcome in my territory. Make sure our business partners understand that this is not negotiable." Elena realized that she was witnessing something important, a glimpse into the code that governed Mateo's world. He was drawing lines, establishing boundaries that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with protecting the vulnerable. Whatever else he might be, whatever crimes he might commit, he was taking a stand against the kind of evil that had nearly destroyed her life. Later, after Sophia had been tucked into bed with stories and songs, Elena found herself alone with Mateo again. They sat on opposite ends of the couch in the sitting room of her suite, the distance between them feeling both too much and not nearly enough. "You're having the trafficking network investigated," she said. "Not just to rescue me. This is bigger than that." Mateo nodded, his expression grim. "They've been operating for months, using my territory as a transit point without permission, taking children from foster care, from shelters, from families who trusted the system to protect them. I've been hunting them since I learned what they were doing." "Why?" Elena asked. "Why do you care about trafficked children when you're in the business of—" She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence without sounding accusatory. "When I was 8 years old," Mateo said quietly, "my family was murdered by a rival cartel. My parents, my younger sister, my grandmother who had raised us when my parents worked late. They were killed because my father had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see and refused to stay silent about it." Elena's breath caught as she processed what he was telling her. He had been Sophia's age when his world was destroyed, had experienced the same kind of loss and terror that Elena fought every day to protect children from experiencing. "I survived because I was at school that day. Came home to find them dead and the house burning. I spent 3 years on the streets, learning that the world is divided between predators and prey, and that the only way to protect yourself is to become more dangerous than the things that hunt you." The pain in his voice was raw and honest, older than his years, but still fresh enough to bleed. Elena understood now why he carried cartoon bandages in his pocket, why he looked at Sophia with such protective tenderness. Every vulnerable child reminded him of the boy he had been, helpless and alone and betrayed by a system that should have kept him safe. When Sophia knocked on my door, she reminded me of myself at that age, desperate and afraid and running out of options. The difference was that she had someone worth saving, someone who had given her enough love to make her brave. I couldn't let her lose that the way I lost my family. Elena felt tears slide down her cheeks, not just for the boy Mateo had been, but for the man he had become. He had built an empire on violence and fear, but he had also used that power to protect people who had no other protection. He was not a hero in any conventional sense, but he was something perhaps more important. He was someone who remembered what it felt like to be helpless and had decided never to let that happen to others if he could prevent it. Without thinking, she reached across the couch and touched his hand, offering comfort the way he had comforted Sophia in the garden. His skin was warm and scarred, hands that had dealt death but were holding her with infinite gentleness. Mateo looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, and Elena saw something vulnerable in his expression that had nothing to do with childhood trauma and everything to do with the woman sitting beside him. The awareness that had been building between them all day crystallized into something that made her heart race and her breathing shallow. He was going to kiss her. She could see it in the way his eyes dropped to her mouth, in the way he leaned slightly closer. And God help her, she wanted him to. Despite everything she knew about his world, despite every rational reason why this was a terrible idea, Elena wanted to feel his mouth against hers with an intensity that frightened her. But before either of them could close the distance between them, Sophia's voice called out from the bedroom, shaky with the remnants of a nightmare. The spell broke as they both moved toward her, the moment lost but the promise of it hanging in the air between them like smoke. As Elena comforted Sophia back to sleep, stroking her hair and humming lullabies until the child's breathing deepened into peaceful slumber, She was acutely aware of Matteo, standing in the doorway watching them. When she finally looked up, their eyes met across the room, and Elena knew with certainty that whatever was building between them was not going away. She was falling for a man whose world was built on violence, whose protection came with consequences she could not begin to understand. But as she watched him smile softly at the sight of Sophia sleeping peacefully in his guest room, Elena realized that she might already be past the point of rational decision-making. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, and Elena was beginning to suspect that she was about to find out exactly where those lines would take her. Elena was reading Sophia a bedtime story when Diego's urgent voice crackled through the intercom system that connected every room in Matteo's compound. "Boss, we have a situation." Two vehicles spotted conducting surveillance from the ridge overlooking the east perimeter. They've been there for 20 minutes. The familiar terror that Elena thought she had left behind in that warehouse came flooding back with devastating force. Her hands began to shake as she clutched the children's book, the words blurring on the page as panic overwhelmed her ability to focus. They had found her. Somehow, despite Matteo's security and the fortress-like protection of his estate, the trafficking network had tracked her down. Sophia sensed her aunt's distress immediately, sitting up in bed with wide eyes that held too much understanding for an 80-year-old. "Are the bad men back?" she asked quietly. Before Elena could find words to reassure her niece, Matteo appeared in the doorway of Sophia's bedroom. He moved with the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to crisis management, but his voice was calm and steady when he spoke to Sophia. "There are some people watching the house who shouldn't be here," he said honestly. "But they can't get inside, and they can't hurt you. My men are going to make sure they leave and don't come back." Sophia nodded solemnly, trusting him in the way that children trusted adults who had proven themselves reliable. But Elena could see the fear creeping back into her niece's expression, the return of the hypervigilance that had marked the days after Elena's kidnapping. "Can you stay with us tonight?" Sophia asked Matteo. "Just until the bad people go away?" Matteo's expression softened as he looked at the child who had somehow claimed a place in his dangerous heart. "Of course, Princessa. I'll be right here all night. You're safe." Elena watched him settle into the armchair beside Sophia's bed. This man who commanded an empire built on violence, but who was now prepared to spend the night guarding a child's sleep. The contrast should have been jarring, but instead it felt right in a way that scared Elena more than the surveillance team outside. As Sophia drifted off to sleep with Matteo's presence providing the security she needed, Elena found herself studying his profile in the dim light from the hallway. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark eyes never stopped moving as he monitored every sound from outside, the careful control that kept his body relaxed despite the tension she could sense radiating from him. When Sophia's breathing deepened into true sleep, Matteo rose from the chair and motioned for Elena to follow him from the room. They moved quietly through the guest suite to the sitting area, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the gardens that were now patrolled by armed men Elena had not seen during the day. "They're gone," Matteo said quietly, checking his phone for updates from his security team. Diego's men followed them for 5 miles before they disappeared into traffic. Professional surveillance, not random criminals. Someone with resources and training. Elena sank onto the couch, her legs suddenly unsteady as the adrenaline from the evening's scare began to fade. She had been telling herself that the worst was over, that the rescue had ended the threat to her and Sophia's safety. But the reality was more complicated than she had wanted to admit. "They're never going to stop, are they?" she said, the words carrying the weight of a terrible realization. "As long as I'm alive to testify about what I saw, as long as I know about the children they took, they'll keep coming." Matteo moved to sit beside her on the couch, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His presence was solid and reassuring, an anchor in the storm of fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. "They'll stop," he said with the kind of quiet certainty that came from years of eliminating threats. "I'm going to make sure they stop permanently. But that might take time, and in the meantime you and Sophia need to stay somewhere they can't reach you." Elena turned to look at him, noting the hard set of his jaw that suggested he was already planning something that would involve violence and finality. She should have been horrified by the implications, should have insisted that law enforcement handle the situation through legal channels. Instead, She felt a guilty sense of relief that someone was willing to take decisive action to protect the people she loved. "Tell me about your work," Matteo said suddenly, his voice gentle enough to pull her from the dark spiral of her thoughts. "Before all this happened, what made you decide to become a social worker?" The question surprised Elena, both because it seemed like an abrupt change of subject and because genuine curiosity colored his tone. Most people asked about her job out of polite obligation, but Matteo seemed truly interested in understanding what motivated her. "My parents died when I was 17, she said slowly, settling into the familiar rhythm of sharing a story she had told many times, but never with this much emotional weight behind it. "Car accident on a rainy night, very sudden. I was a senior in high school, had been accepted to college with plans to study business. Sophia was only 3, and suddenly I was responsible for a toddler when I barely knew how to take care of myself." Matteo listened without interruption, his dark eyes focused on her face with an intensity that made Elena feel like every word mattered to him. She found herself sharing details she usually kept private, drawn out by his patient attention and the safety of the quiet room where they sat together. "Those first few years were impossible," she continued. "I had no idea what I was doing. Social services wanted to put Sophia in foster care because they didn't think I was equipped to raise a child. I had to fight for 2 years to prove that I could provide a stable home for her." "That fight showed you what the system was like from the other side," Matteo observed. "Showed you how easily children could fall through cracks or end up in situations where they weren't protected." Elena nodded, surprised by his insight. "Exactly. I saw how many kids were aging out of foster care with no support, how many were bounced between placements, how many disappeared entirely because no one was keeping track of them properly. When I finally got custody of Sophia permanently, I decided to go back to school and study social work. I wanted to be the person I wished we had encountered during those difficult years. And you've spent the last 8 years trying to save children who were in the same situation you and Sophia faced," Matteo said. "Children who had no one else fighting for them." The understanding in his voice made Elena's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Most people saw her job as thankless and exhausting, which it often was. But Matteo saw the deeper motivation, the personal mission that drove her to work long hours for terrible pay in a system that often felt broken beyond repair. "Some of them I can help," she said quietly. "Some of them I can't. The trafficking ring I discovered was taking kids who should have been safe, kids who were supposed to be protected by the system. When I realized what was happening, I couldn't just file a report and hope someone else would handle it. I had to try to stop it myself. Even though it put you in danger," Matteo said. "Even though it meant risking the life you had built with Sophia." Elena met his gaze, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. He understood the weight of impossible choices, the burden of trying to protect people when protection came with its own costs. "What choice did I have?" she asked. "How could I know that children were being sold and do nothing about it? How could I live with myself if I stayed safe while they suffered?" "The same way I couldn't ignore Sophia when she showed up at my door," Matteo replied. "The same way I can't walk away from this fight, even though it would be easier to let someone else handle it." They looked at each other across the small space between them on the couch, both of them recognizing something fundamental that they shared. They were both people who had been shaped by loss and trauma, who had chosen to use their pain as motivation to protect others rather than allowing it to make them bitter or selfish. Elena felt her heart racing as she realized how close they were sitting, how the conversation had drawn them together both physically and emotionally. Matteo's eyes had darkened as he looked at her, and she could see the same awareness building in his expression that she felt coursing through her own body. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been restraint, "I need you to understand something. What I'm feeling for you, it's not just gratitude or protection or obligation. It's more than that, and it's getting harder to ignore." She should have been frightened by the intensity in his voice, should have stepped back from the precipice they were approaching. Instead, Elena found herself leaning closer, drawn by the honesty in his confession and the heat that seemed to radiate from his skin. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too. I know I shouldn't. Know it's complicated and dangerous and probably insane. But I can't stop thinking about you, about the way you look at Sophia like she's precious, about the way you've taken care of us when you didn't have to." Matteo reached up to cup her face in his large hands, his thumb stroking across her cheekbones with devastating gentleness. Elena's breath caught as she felt the calluses on his fingers, reminders of the violence that shaped his world but somehow made his tenderness even more meaningful. "If we do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's no going back to simple. My world is dangerous, and anyone I care about becomes a target. I can protect you and Sophia, but I can't promise it will ever be easy or safe." Elena searched his face, seeing the vulnerability beneath his strength, the fear that she would reject him because of what he was rather than embracing him for who he had shown himself to be. In that moment, she realized that she had already made her choice, had probably made it the first time she watched him comfort Sophia with cartoon bandages and infinite patience. "I'm already in danger," she said softly. "I'm already a target. But with you, for the first time since this nightmare started, I feel like I might actually be safe. Not just protected, but safe. Like I could build something real with someone who understands what it means to fight for the people you love." Mateo's control finally snapped at her words, and he kissed her with the kind of desperate hunger that comes from weeks of restraint finally breaking. Elena melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she responded with equal passion. He tasted like coffee and mint, like safety and danger combined, like everything she had not known she was missing. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. This was not just physical attraction or grateful affection. This was something deeper and more terrifying, something that could change the entire trajectory of her life. "Are you sure?" Mateo asked, his forehead resting against hers as they shared the same breath. "Because once I have you, Elena, once I know what it feels like to hold you and touch you and love you, I'm never going to want to let you go." Elena answered by kissing him again, pouring all of her certainty and desire and overwhelming emotion into the contact between their mouths. Mateo groaned softly against her lips, his hands tangling in her hair as he pulled her closer, eliminating any remaining space between their bodies. What followed was slow and tender and perfect in ways Elena had never experienced before. Mateo loved her with the same patient intensity he brought to everything else, taking time to worship every inch of skin he revealed, making sure she felt cherished rather than claimed. He whispered Spanish endearments against her throat, told her she was beautiful and brave and precious, while his hands mapped the curves of her body with reverent attention. When Elena finally fell asleep in his arms hours later, she felt fundamentally changed by the experience of being loved so completely by someone who understood both strength and vulnerability. Mateo's heartbeat beneath her cheek was steady and reassuring, his arms around her providing the kind of security she had never thought to find in another person. The morning brought coffee and fresh fruit delivered by Rosa, who smiled knowingly but discreetly when she found them together on the couch. Sophia bounded into the room shortly after, chattering about plans for the day with the resilience that children showed in bouncing back from fear. Elena watched Mateo listen to Sophia's excited planning with the same serious attention he had given to security briefings, and she felt her heart swell with an emotion too big to name. This could be her life, she realized. This strange, complicated, beautiful family they were building from shared trauma and unexpected love. As if sensing her thoughts, Mateo caught her hand under the breakfast table, intertwining their fingers with a possessiveness that should have alarmed her, but instead made her feel treasured. When Sophia ran off to play in the garden, he leaned close enough for Elena to smell his cologne and feel the warmth of his breath against her ear. "I meant what I said last night," he murmured, "about not letting you go. I hope you're prepared for that level of devotion, because I've never felt anything like this before." Elena turned to meet his gaze, seeing the vulnerability beneath his confidence, the fear that she might still change her mind about accepting his world. Instead of answering with words, she kissed him softly, letting the gesture speak for itself. She was prepared. She was ready. She was home. The attack came at 3 in the morning, when the compound was at its most vulnerable and the traffickers thought they could strike without detection. Elena woke to the sound of gunfire echoing across the estate grounds, the sharp crack of automatic weapons cutting through the peaceful silence that had lulled her to sleep in Mateo's arms. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as the familiar terror of the warehouse came flooding back. But this time was different. This time she was not helpless and alone. This time she had Matteo beside her, already moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had survived countless attacks. "Safe room, now," he said, pulling on his clothes with military precision. "Take Sophia and go to the panic room behind the bookshelf in my study. The door is hidden, but it opens with your handprint now. I programmed the scanner yesterday." Elena stared at him, processing the implications of what he had just revealed. He had anticipated this attack, had prepared for the possibility that the traffickers would come for them with overwhelming force. More than that, he had made sure she could access the most secure part of his compound, trusting her with security measures that probably cost more than her annual salary. "You knew this was coming," she said, not accusingly, but with the dawning realization that Matteo had been several steps ahead of their enemies from the beginning. "I knew they would try," he replied, checking the ammunition in his sidearm with practiced movements. "They can't afford to let you live, and they can't afford to let me challenge their operation without consequences. This was always going to end with violence." The sound of Sophia calling for them from her bedroom cut through Elena's questions about strategy and preparation. The child was awake and frightened, probably reliving the trauma of Elena's kidnapping through the sound of gunfire getting closer to the house. Elena's protective instincts overrode everything else as she ran to comfort her niece. Sophia was sitting up in bed, clutching her teddy bear, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the battle raging outside. When she saw Elena, she launched herself into her aunt's arms with the desperate relief of someone who had thought she might be abandoned again. "It's okay, baby," Elena murmured, stroking Sophia's hair while her own hands shook with barely controlled fear. "Mr. Matteo is going to keep us safe. We just need to go to a special room where the bad men can't find us." Matteo appeared in the doorway, now dressed in tactical gear that transformed him from the gentle man who made breakfast and played with paint into someone who looked capable of single-handedly winning a war. But when he looked at Sophia, his expression remained soft despite the violence surrounding them. "Princessa," he said calmly, "I need you to be very brave for me. Can you do that?" Sophia nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand in a gesture so achingly familiar that Elena's chest tightened with protective love. Matteo knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to Sophia's eye level with the patience of someone who understood that children needed reassurance more than they needed rushed orders. "The bad men are here, but they can't get inside the house. My men are keeping them outside where they belong. You and Tia Elena are going to stay in my special safe room until it's over. It has snacks and movies and even some of your art supplies." "How did you know about my art supplies?" Sophia asked, momentarily distracted from her fear. "Because I pay attention to what makes you happy," Matteo replied simply. "And because I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed if something like this ever happened." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the casual admission that Matteo had been planning for Sophia's comfort during a potential attack. He had been thinking about cartoon movies and coloring books while preparing for warfare, making sure that an 80-year-old would be entertained and reassured even if their lives were in immediate danger. The three of them moved quickly through the house to Matteo's study, where he showed Elena the hidden mechanism that opened a seamless section of the bookshelf. Behind it was a room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a panic room, complete with beds, a kitchenette, entertainment system, and enough supplies to last for days. "The walls are reinforced steel," Matteo explained as he helped them inside. "Communications array so you can contact me or Diego if needed. Medical supplies in the cabinet by the bathroom. The door locks from the inside and won't open for anyone except you, me, or Diego." Elena turned to face him, suddenly understanding that he was saying goodbye. He was going out to face whatever force the traffickers had brought against them, and there was no guarantee he would survive the encounter. The thought of losing him now, just when she had found him, just when she had discovered what it felt like to be loved so completely, hit her with devastating force. "Matteo," she started to say, but he silenced her with a kiss that tasted like desperation and promise combined. "I'll come back," he said against her mouth. "I'll always come back to you. Both of you." Then he was gone, the hidden door sealing shut behind him with the kind of finality that suggested it was designed to withstand explosions. Elena stood in the sudden silence of the safe room, holding Sophia against her chest while listening to the muffled sounds of combat from outside. This was the moment of truth, she realized. This was when she had to decide whether she truly trusted Matteo with their lives, whether she believed in his capability and his devotion enough to let him fight for them while she waited in safety. Every instinct screamed at her to find a way to help, to contribute to their protection rather than hiding passively behind reinforced walls. But Sophia needed her here, needed the stability of Elena's presence while the world exploded around them. And Matteo needed to know that the people he was fighting for were safe, that he could focus on eliminating threats without worrying about their immediate security. So Elena settled onto the couch with Sophia, turning on a Disney movie and pretending that her heart was not hammering with terror while the man she loved risked his life to protect them. She made hot chocolate in the kitchenette and helped Sophia color pictures, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while bullets shattered the peaceful night outside. The battle lasted 2 hours that felt like a lifetime. Elena tracked the progression through the sounds that filtered through the steel walls, the initial intensity giving way to sporadic gunfire and finally to silence that could have meant victory or death. When the hidden door finally opened, Elena's breath caught in her throat as she waited to see who would enter. It was Matteo, alive and unharmed, but splattered with blood that she hoped belonged to someone else. His tactical gear was torn and dirty, his face grim with the aftermath of violence, but his eyes were alive and focused on the two people who had become his entire world. Sophia launched herself into his arms with a cry of relief, and Matteo caught her easily, holding her tight while meeting Elena's gaze over the child's head. In his eyes, Elena saw the man who had just killed to protect them, the leader who had coordinated their defense with lethal efficiency. But she also saw the gentleness that made him kneel down to comfort a frightened child, the vulnerability that made him fear losing the family he had found in the most unexpected way. "It's over," he said simply. "The trafficking network is finished. Their leadership is dead, their operations dismantled. They'll never threaten you or Sophia again." Elena felt something break open in her chest, a release of tension she had been carrying since her kidnapping weeks ago. But more than that, she felt a surge of overwhelming gratitude for this man who had risked everything to keep them safe, who had eliminated a threat that law enforcement had been unable or unwilling to address. "Thank you," she whispered, but the words felt inadequate for what he had done. Later, after Sophia had been settled back in her own bed with extra stories and reassurances, Elena and Matteo found themselves alone in his study. The hidden panel had closed again, concealing the safe room that had protected them during the attack. Outside, his men were cleaning up the aftermath of the battle, restoring the compound to its usual state of peaceful vigilance. Matteo had showered and changed, but Elena could still see the weight of the night's violence in the way he held his shoulders, in the careful control that kept his hands steady despite everything he had just endured. She understood now that this was his reality, that violence and protection were inextricably linked in his world. "How do you do it?" she asked quietly. "How do you live with the knowledge that people want to hurt the ones you care about?" Matteo looked at her with eyes that held years of hard-won wisdom. "You do what you have to do to keep them safe," he said. "You accept that some threats can only be stopped permanently. You make peace with being the monster so that the people you love can sleep peacefully." Elena studied his face, seeing not a monster, but a man who had shaped himself into exactly what was needed to protect the vulnerable. She thought about the trafficking victims he had rescued, about Sophia's laughter in his garden, about the way he had prepared cartoon movies for a child's comfort during a terrorist attack. "I'm not afraid of your world anymore," she said, the words carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. "I was terrified tonight, but not of you. Never of you. I was afraid of losing what we've built together, afraid that something would take you away from us." Matteo stepped closer, his dark eyes searching her face for any sign of uncertainty or regret. "What are you saying, Elena?" "I'm saying that I choose this," she replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I choose you, your world, the life we could build together. I choose the man who carries cartoon bandages for hurt children and who kills traffickers to protect innocents. I choose all of it." "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion that he was no longer trying to hide. "Are you sure? Because once you say yes to this life, there's no going back to normal. You'll always be a target, always need protection, always have to live with the knowledge that I've done terrible things in the name of keeping you safe. I've never felt safer than I do with you." Elena said firmly. I've never felt more protected, or more cherished, or more loved. Whatever challenges come with your world, we'll face them together. You, me, and Sophia. As a family. The word family seemed to break something loose in Mateo's carefully controlled composure. He pulled her against his chest, holding her with the desperate intensity of someone who had thought he might lose everything that mattered to him. Elena felt his shoulders shake as he buried his face in her hair, and she realized that this powerful, dangerous man was crying with relief. I love you, he whispered against her neck. I love you both more than I thought I was capable of loving anything. You've changed everything for me, Elena. You've made me want to be better than I thought I could be. I love you too, she replied, the words feeling both momentous and inevitable. I love your strength and your gentleness and your dedication to protecting people who can't protect themselves. I love the way you look at Sophia like she's the most precious thing in the world. I love who we are together. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just committed to. This was not a typical love story, Elena realized. This was something deeper and more complicated, forged in trauma and sealed with violence, but also built on genuine care and mutual understanding. Marry me, Mateo said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised Elena. Not because of what happened tonight. Not because of gratitude or protection or any of the practical reasons. Marry me because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because I want to give you and Sophia everything I have. Because I want to build something lasting with the two people who saved me from being alone. Elena looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability beneath his strength, the hope beneath his fear of rejection. This man who commanded absolute loyalty from dangerous people was asking her to choose him. To build a life that would be unconventional and challenging, but also filled with the kind of love that most people never experienced. Yes, she said simply, watching his face transform with joy and relief. Yes to all of it. When they told Sophia the next morning, the child's reaction was immediate and wholehearted approval. She clapped her hands and demanded to know if this meant Mateo would be her new daddy, if they could have a real wedding with a cake, if she could pick out Elena's dress. As Elena watched Mateo promise Sophia that she would always be his princessa, that he would always protect her and love her and be the father she deserved, she felt her heart swell with an emotion too big to contain. They were building something beautiful from the ashes of trauma, creating a family that would be stronger for having survived the fire that brought them together. This was not the life Elena had planned, but it was the life she wanted. And for the first time since her parents died, she felt truly, completely home. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Elena stood in what had once been Mateo's formal dining room and was now the headquarters of the Herrera Foundation for Child Protection Services. The mahogany table that had hosted business meetings for his various enterprises was covered with case files, funding proposals, and photographs of children who had been rescued from situations that would have been impossible to address without substantial resources and connections that operated outside normal legal channels. Elena reviewed the monthly report with a satisfaction that went deeper than professional accomplishment. In half a year, they had intercepted 4 separate trafficking operations, established 3 new safe houses for at-risk youth, and created a scholarship program that would send 23 former foster children to college. The foundation operated with a budget that dwarfed anything Elena had worked with in her previous job, funded by the legitimate businesses that Mateo had been quietly building alongside his more questionable enterprises. The irony was not lost on her that she was doing the most effective work of her career, using money that came from sources she probably did not want to examine too closely. But the results spoke for themselves. Children who would have disappeared into the system's cracks were now safe, educated, and given opportunities that would have been impossible without Mateo's particular combination of resources and ruthlessness. Sophia burst through the office doors with the kind of enthusiasm that only 9-year-old children could sustain, her school backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she ran to hug Elena. Behind her, more sedately but with obvious affection, came Mateo, still wearing the expensive suit he favored for legitimate business meetings, but carrying Sophia's art project from school with the careful reverence he reserved for anything she created. "Tio Elena," Sophia announced breathlessly, Mrs. Rodriguez said my essay about family was the best in the class. And Tio Mateo promised to help me build a volcano for the science fair next week. Elena looked at Mateo over Sophia's head, noting the way his eyes crinkled with genuine happiness when he talked about mundane parental responsibilities like science fair projects. This man, who had once been described in newspaper articles as one of the most dangerous people in the state, was now concerned about whether they had enough baking soda to make a proper volcanic eruption. The transformation had not happened overnight, and it had not been without complications. There had been moments when Elena questioned whether she could truly build a life with someone whose past contained so much violence. Moments when the reality of his world clashed with her idealistic vision of how justice should work. But those moments had been overwhelmed by countless others. Mateo reading bedtime stories to Sofia in Spanish, patiently teaching her to cook his grandmother's recipes, attending parent-teacher conferences with the same serious attention he brought to strategic planning. More than that, Elena had come to understand that Mateo's methods, while unconventional, achieved results that the legal system could not or would not accomplish. The trafficking network that had taken her was gone completely, not just disrupted but eliminated. The children they had rescued were not just returned to inadequate foster care, but given genuine opportunities for healing and growth. The foundation operated with an efficiency that came from having resources and connections that transcended normal bureaucratic limitations. As Sophia chattered about her day at school, Elena found herself thinking about the conversation she had had with her former supervisor at the Department of Children's Services. Margaret had called the previous week to offer Elena her old job back, along with a promotion and significant raise. The conversation had been awkward, filled with carefully worded questions about Elena's current living situation and current source of income. Elena had politely declined, explaining that she was now in a position to help more children than ever before, just through different channels. Margaret's disapproval had been clear even through the phone, her discomfort with Elena's association with someone like Mateo evident in every carefully professional word. But Margaret had never seen Mateo cry while reading news reports about abused children, had never watched him personally deliver Christmas presents to every child in the Foundation's care, had never witnessed the way he transformed from ruthless businessman to gentle father figure the moment Sophia entered a room. Margaret saw only the reputation and the rumors, not the man who used his dangerous connections to protect people who had no other protection. The wedding planning had become Sophia's favorite topic of conversation, and she had appointed herself as chief coordinator of an event that was rapidly growing beyond Elena's original vision of a simple civil ceremony. Sophia had very specific opinions about flowers, cake flavors, and dress styles, opinions that Mateo indulged with the kind of patient attention that suggested he found her excitement more important than any practical considerations. "Can we look at more dress pictures tonight?" Sophia asked Elena as they walked through the compound toward the main house. "I found some with sparkles that I think you'd really like." Elena laughed, ruffling Sophia's hair with the kind of casual affection that had become second nature over the past months. "We can look at a few more, but remember what we talked about. The dress is just one day. What matters is the family we're building together." "I know," Sophia said solemnly, "but you're going to be the most beautiful bride ever, and Tio Mateo should get to see you in a dress with sparkles." The family they were building. Elena thought about that phrase as they entered the kitchen where Rosa was preparing dinner with the kind of elaborate care that suggested she considered feeding them to be a sacred responsibility. Sophia immediately began helping with table settings, chattering to Rosa in a mixture of English and Spanish that had become her natural mode of communication since moving to the compound. Elena watched Mateo lean against the kitchen counter, loosening his tie while he listened to Sophia's detailed recap of her school day. This domestic scene, warm and comfortable and utterly normal, still sometimes caught Elena off guard with its impossible perfection. 6 months ago, she had been a single social worker struggling to make ends meet while raising her niece alone. Now she was part of a family that felt more complete and secure than anything she had experienced since her own parents died. The pregnancy had been unplanned but not unwelcome, discovered during a routine checkup that Elena had almost postponed due to the Foundation's demanding schedule. When she told Mateo, his reaction had been immediate and overwhelming joy, followed quickly by protective concern that bordered on obsessive. He had immediately begun researching the best obstetricians in the state, had ordered prenatal vitamins in bulk, and had started reading parenting books with the same focused intensity he brought to strategic planning. Sophia's reaction had been even more enthusiastic, if possible. The prospect of a baby brother or sister had filled her with excitement that lasted for days, followed by detailed plans for teaching the baby to paint and read and play games. She had already begun preparing drawings that she intended to hang in the nursery, creating an art gallery that would welcome her new sibling with all the love and creativity she possessed. As they sat down to dinner that evening, Elena looked around the table at the family she had never expected to find. Sophia, chattering excitedly about school projects and wedding plans, her face bright with the security of knowing she was loved and protected. Matteo, listening with patient attention to Sophia's stories while keeping one hand resting possessively on Elena's knee, his touch a constant reminder of the love that had transformed both of their lives. And Elena herself, pregnant with their child and surrounded by more love and stability than she had ever dared to hope for. This was not the life she had planned when she first became a social worker, driven by idealistic dreams of changing the system from within. This was something bigger and more complicated, built on foundations that would never be entirely respectable, but that achieved results she could never have imagined through conventional means. "Tell me again about the night you came to my door," Matteo said to Sophia as Rosa served dessert, his voice carrying the wonder that still colored his memories of that midnight encounter. "Tell me what made you brave enough to ask a stranger for help." Sophia considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all of Matteo's requests for stories about their early days together. "I wasn't brave," she said finally. "I was scared. But Tia Elena always told me that sometimes when you're really scared, that's when you have to do the scary thing anyway. She said brave people aren't the ones who aren't afraid. They're the ones who do what's right even when they're terrified." Matteo's eyes met Elena's across the table, both of them recognizing the truth in Sophia's words. They had all done terrifying things in the months that brought them together, had all made choices that required courage they had not known they possessed. Elena had chosen to trust a man whose world contradicted everything she had been taught about justice. Matteo had chosen to open his heart to people who made him vulnerable in ways that could have destroyed him. Sophia had chosen to seek help from a stranger because she believed in the power of love to overcome impossible odds. As Elena helped Sophia get ready for bed that night, reading stories and singing lullabies that had become precious rituals in their new life, she thought about the question she wanted to ask everyone who might be listening to their story. She thought about the people who might be facing their own impossible choices, their own moments when desperation forced them to seek help in unexpected places. When Sophia was finally asleep, Elena found Matteo in his study, working on paperwork related to the Foundation's latest project. He looked up when she entered, his expression immediately softening with the love that still sometimes overwhelmed her with its intensity. Without words, she settled into his lap, letting him wrap his arms around her while she rested her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if Sophia hadn't knocked on your door that night?" Elena asked quietly. Matteo's arms tightened around her, his hand moving to rest over the subtle curve where their child was growing. "Every day," he said. "I think about how close I came to never finding you, never knowing what it felt like to have a family, never understanding what I was fighting for beyond territory and respect." Elena turned to look at his face, seeing the man who had saved her life and transformed his own in the process. "I spent so many years believing that love was something that happened to other people," she said. "Something that required perfect circumstances and uncomplicated choices. I never imagined I could find it with someone whose world was so different from mine." "Love doesn't follow rules," Matteo replied, stroking her hair with the gentleness that never failed to amaze her. "It shows up in the most unexpected places, with the most unlikely people, at moments when you think your life is falling apart beyond repair." Elena thought about that truth as they prepared for bed, as Matteo checked the security monitors with the habitual vigilance that kept them safe, as they settled together under covers that had become a sanctuary where the dangers of his world could not touch them. She thought about the people who might be listening to their story, people who were facing their own dark nights of the soul. She hoped they understood that sometimes the most unlikely alliances could become the most precious relationships. Sometimes protection came from sources you never expected to trust. Sometimes love required courage that you did not know you possessed, the willingness to embrace a life that looked nothing like what you had planned. Do you believe in second chances? She wanted to ask them. Do you believe that people can transform, that love can bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, that families can be built from the ashes of trauma and loss? Because if you do, if you've ever found yourself hoping that impossible love stories can come true, then maybe you understand why this midnight knock on a dangerous man's door became the beginning of something beautiful. As Elena drifted toward sleep in Mateo's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and feeling the flutter of movement from the child they had created together, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. It was not the place she had expected, not the life she had planned, but it was exactly where she belonged. In the morning, Sophia would wake them with excited chatter about wedding plans and baby preparations. The foundation would continue its work of protecting children who had nowhere else to turn. Mateo would continue to use his particular combination of legitimate influence and questionable connections to achieve results that conventional methods could not accomplish. And Elena would continue to love them both with the fierce devotion that had grown from those first moments of impossible attraction, the love that had transformed a midnight plea for help into the foundation of a family that would last a lifetime. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with a knock on the devil's door. Sometimes salvation came from the most unlikely source. Sometimes a little girl's courage could change everything for the better. Sophia was safe and loved, exactly as she deserved to be. Elena was fulfilled in ways she had never imagined possible. And Mateo had been transformed from a man who lived for power and control into someone who lived for love and protection and the laughter of a child who had seen him as a hero when no one else would. It had all started with 3 soft knocks at midnight and a child's unwavering belief that even the most dangerous people could choose to do good. And from that moment of desperate faith had grown a love story that proved sometimes the most unlikely people could save each other.